So the way I think about conferences is kind of like this. There's roughly 275 people here. You're all making pretty good money. So in the next 25 minutes, this is kind of what this talk needs to be worth. No one ever really thinks of it this way, but in reality, I feel like that's what it is. So let's get started. So initially, what I had proposed was basically like, if you hadn't been paying attention to React for the last few years, I was going to get you caught up in like 25 minutes. The reality of what happened was it kind of just turned into this, which is like why React hooks, right? That's great. The problem is going last. We've covered this a few times now. So what I want you to do is just pretend, as far as the structure goes, I do a lot of like education stuff, right? So I try to think of like, okay, what's like the linear path to learning? Pretend I'm going first. Pretend Eric went second, and then Michael dove into like the hardcore stuff, okay? So everyone just go back to like 9 a.m. this morning, and we'll be good. So that's kind of where the talk is going to be positioned. So again, a lot of you know I kind of have strong opinions on education. With that, I try to, again, take kind of like the linear approach to what we're doing. And another thing I like to do is take into the talk the historical context, specifically like, so if you're learning async await, it's better to really like learn callbacks first and then promises. And so that's exactly what we're going to do with this talk, is instead of just diving into hooks, we're going to go way back and really talk about the history of React and how we got to this point today. And by doing that, I think you're all going to better understand why hooks exist. Because if you think about React, right? React, when hooks came out, it was objectively the most popular front-end framework. And according to Stack Overflow, was the most loved front-end framework. So that's a pretty big and risky gamble to take, is like creating a very large change in the ecosystem. As Michael mentioned earlier, it's kind of like React version 2, right? And so with that, there's a few really important whys that we're going to cover in this talk. So first date, June 14, 1998. Does anyone know what happened this date? I was not born, no. I'm not that young, no. This was the day Brian Russell pushed off on Michael Jordan. How it's relevant is I'm from Utah. Someone in Chicago gave me a mic, so I just had to get that off. Okay, he pushed off. It's clear. We're good. Okay. I don't know if I'll get this chance again, so we're going with it. We're going with it. Next up, May 29th, 2013. React. Yeah, so this is when the first version came out. This is Tom Moe. He's speaking at JSConf in 2013. And the thing that's so interesting about this talk, this is Jordan, he's kind of one of the main brains behind React, is if you look at this code sample here, I don't know if you can see it, it's going to be blurry. React then is pretty much exactly the same as it is now, as far as like principles go. Like the syntax has changed a little bit and the API has changed a little bit, but fundamentally everything's exactly the same. That's what's so impressive about it. We still have state, we still have props, we still have composition, but nothing else, as far as principle goes, everything is the same as it is today. So this is how we used to write classes. We actually saw some code in the debugging talk earlier. We saw get initial state. I didn't expect that, but we did see it. So this is kind of how we used to write React. If you've been writing React for less than, I'd say, like a year and a half, maybe 2 years, this is new to you. So what happened was January 17, 2015, ES6 was officially formed. And with that, we got class declarations. So create class then moved to, there's this quote in the release docs, in version 13, or I guess 0.13 of React. They said, we figure we're not in the business of designing a class system. We just want to use whatever is the idiomatic JavaScript way of creating classes. So then that's when React.component was introduced. And that's when we did that migration from create class to React.component. So as we've seen plenty of times today, we have our constructor method here. We have our lifecycle. So everything is still the same, except instead of just passing kind of like an object to React and saying, hey, this is everything that has to do with React, what we're doing now is we have a class. But with that, it wasn't all just great, right? There were some trade-offs in doing that. The nice part is React better aligns itself with JavaScript and kind of like the ECMAScript standard. But we had to all start writing super props, which was not really like a huge deal, but it was more just like annoying, right? Where in order to use the this keyword in the constructor, you have to call super first. With React, we have to pass in props for some reason. Dan wrote a post about it that we all know now, but for the longest time, we all just kind of did it because that's what they told us to do, right? The next thing, and this was the worst thing, is with create class, they auto-bound the this keyword for you. And then when we switched over to using classes, everyone very quickly realized that no one knew how the this keyword worked. And this question became very popular. And we've all been there, right? And it's been viewed 180,000 times. There's like 30, and the thing is, that number is like super, it's not reality because there's like 50 different versions of this question on Stack Overflow. So that's kind of the reality, is like, there was this trade-off from going from create class to React.component. And up until this point, it looks like those issues are kind of superficial, because what happened was class fields came along and they kind of just solved these for us. So class fields was a stage, or is currently, I think, a stage 3 proposal. Basically what it allows you to do is add instance properties directly as properties on your class. So here we can get rid of constructor, which means we don't have to call super anymore because we can just have properties on our state. Another thing, we don't have to bind anymore because we can just have our methods be arrow functions here, and without going too far into this keyword, when you have an arrow function, it just kind of works as you'd expect, which is really nice. So at this point, we're pretty good, right? Unfortunately, there's still... This is the best GIF because it's just like so alarming. Like no one expected it. Every talk I've ever given has this GIF in it. It's the best. It's an easy laugh. Okay, so there's still some issues, and they're harder to solve than just kind of the superficial issues we saw earlier. So we're duplicating logic in a few places, specifically with life cycles. If you think about like the nature of how life cycles are set up, by design, you're kind of forced to sprinkle logic everywhere throughout your component. So in our example here, and I didn't really explain this earlier, this example, it takes in an ID as its prop, and then it fetches some repos from some API, and then it sets state, and then we see like all the repos on the page, right? So notice here that we have 3 different methods to do one thing, which is basically just keep in sync our local state with whatever the API returns us. So in order to do that, we have to sprinkle, again, all of our logic throughout our component because lifecycles force us to do that. Next is sharing non-visual logic. So when it comes to React, it's all about composition. Michael did a great job of kind of defining that earlier. We build our components, we compose those components together, and then we get our UI. When you think about composition in React, usually you're almost entirely thinking about UI composition, right? Everything's visual. But the reality is when we build applications, there's more composition going on than just like the UI layer. Sometimes we want to compose with things that are non-visual. And so the way that traditionally React kind of couples the component to the UI, it makes sharing non-visual logic tricky because we have that like very defined UI in our inner method. So here, say we wanted, for example, to take all of this logic and we wanted to use it in another component. So say for whatever reason, we had another component that needed this repo's logic. So one process would just be to like copy and paste. And if you did that, honestly, like, I get it. It's the quickest way. Unfortunately, it's probably not the best way. So then, February 11, 2015, anyone know what that date is? I'm actually not going to talk about it. We're just going to like forget about Redux. I'm going to pretend it doesn't exist. Any other ideas? This is when Sebastian's like, again, one of the main heads of, made brains behind React. This is it, yeah. So he went to GitHub and he's like, guys, listen, check this out. He's like, we have this problem of sharing non-visual logic. So what if, try to get this right, what if we have a function, that function takes in an argument as its component, and then that function returns a new component class. We stick all of the shared logic that we want in multiple components in that single component, and then have that component that we're returning render the component that's being passed in as the argument. And we're all just like, all right, like, it's Sebastian, so like whatever he says, like that, like sure, right? From there was like a bunch of like medium think pieces, and everyone's just like, all right, let's go. So that's what we started doing. So this is why we ended up getting stuff like this, right? Where we have it with repos, takes in a component, renders or returns another component, Eventually, we render the initial component, we pass it some props, we pass it state. Basically, we're doing all of this because sharing non-visual logic in React is tricky. So we're like trying to hack a way to decouple the render method or like the UI from the component. Another example of this is render props. We won't get into that, but it's basically kind of trying to solve the same issues. So and this is kind of just us using it. So anywhere that we wanted to get the repos, we can just export our component, wrapping it in the invocation of with repos, and it'll be passed, loading, and then repos. So issues with this is it kind of is just weird, right? You've all kind of gotten that vibe. Whenever I'm learning something new, I try to think, is this thing actually weird, or is it just weird because like I'm new to it, right? With higher order components, it was just always weird. Even after like teaching it, it was just like this thing is just weird no matter how long I've been doing it. So that was another issue. Another issue is it kind of just became too much too quick, right? In reality, you start getting stuff that looks like this, where you have with hover, with theme, with auth, with repos, and then like the rendered output kind of looks like this, and it's just a lot. So here's kind of where we're at. What time did I start? You know, am I good on time? You good? Okay. Here's where we're at. So we use classes for React components. That's kind of what we've always done. Calling super props is annoying. No one knows how this works. There's a joke. Organizing our components by lifecycle methods forces us to sprinkle related logic throughout our components, as we've seen, and React has no good primitive for sharing non-visual logic. So this is what makes hooks so impressive. Is it's a few years ago, you're the React team, you have all of these issues, and again, React is the most popular UI library/framework in the world. You have all of these issues you need to solve, and you need to have an API that's simple, composable, flexible, and extendable. So you have all of these different constraints, and you still have to push, you don't have to, but you're trying to design a new API that solves all of these different issues. And I think that's what's so impressive about hooks that no one really talks a lot about, is the amount of constraints the React team had and the solution they came up with is very impressive. So John Carmack, Oculus VR CTO, is kind of an understatement. Sometimes the elegant implementation is just a function, not a method, not a class, not a framework, just a function. So you can say goodbye to React.component and then hello to function, which we should all be very excited about. And I know Dan Abramov watches like everything. He's going to see this and he's going to be like, no, like you can still use component. I get it. That's just a side. Like we're not actually throwing away React.component. It's just like a figure of speech, Dan. Okay. I know, 100% of the time, he'll DM me. Like, don't say that. Like, sorry, Dan. So just getting rid of classes itself, look at our list now. Just getting rid of the class itself solves a lot of our issues, right? Where we don't have to call super props. We can kind of just forget about the this keyword. It solves all of our superficial issues that we talked about. We still have some fundamental issues. So now what we need to do, now that we don't have class, we need to figure out a way to add state, life cycles, and sharing non-visual logic inside of our component. So this is when hooks are introduced. Again, it's 9 a.m. This is maybe one of the first times you've seen hooks, so you're all super stoked about this. Thank you. So useState is the first hook that allows you to basically add state to your function component. It returns an array, which is usually written like this, where we just structure that. So the first item in the array is the actual state value itself, and the second item is like an updater function to update that state. So now repos grid, we've taken out all of the actual data fetching logic, and we just have the state now. So this is what it looks like. So that's a step in the right direction. Next, we need to figure out life cycles. And as I mentioned earlier, the problem with life cycles is like fundamentally they're broken, because fundamentally the way that we architect our component with life cycles forces us to duplicate logic in various places. So we kind of need to just rethink this whole thing. So again, life cycles, figuratively get rid of them, and you can think more in terms of synchronization. Whenever you've used, most of the time, whenever you've used a life cycle method in the past, usually it's for synchronizing something probably inside of React land with something outside of React land, right? So you're synchronizing maybe the local state with an API request, or you're synchronizing local state with the DOM or vice versa. So I figured I've come to the conclusion that that's kind of the mental model for thinking about hooks. And the way that we can define ways to synchronize our code is with the useEffect hook that you've seen a few times today as well. So here what we're doing is we're synchronizing the title on the page to whatever username is, which probably lives on the state of our component. So our example now looks something like this, where we have our useState loading lines there. We have our useEffect. We don't have a class. We don't have this. We don't have super. Now everything is living inside of the component. But notice here, what useEffect allows us to do is we don't have to sprinkle that data fetching logic all around our component. Like when the component mounts and then when we get new props, it's all just right there located in the same spot, which is really nice. Next is sharing non-visual logic. And I think this is probably the most important part of hooks. I don't have a funny joke or anything to like take a break drinking water, so I'm just going to drink some water real quick. So traditionally, again, React couples UI to a component. This is why we get patterns like higher-order components and render props. But with hooks, Michael touched on this earlier, they're just functions, right? There's nothing inherently coupling UI to a hook, and that's what makes this so powerful, is we can just take all of our data fetching logic and all of our loading logic, all of our state, stick it inside of this custom hook. It takes in an ID, and then what it returns is just the data that the component cares about, which is really just the loading status and the repos. And then we can kind of keep the same API here. We can return an array. The first spot's going to be loading, second spot's going to be repos. And then now what that allows us to do is anywhere where we want to use repos, we can just use our useRepos hook. We'll get back loading, and we'll get back repos. So now what we've done is we've solved all of the use cases that we had before with classes, but what's more impressive about it is we've still maintained all of these things that people loved about React in the first place. So in closing, I think the marketing pitch, and really kind of what everyone ran with, was that you can, with hooks, you can use state and functional components. In reality, it's way more than that. Hooks allow you to improve your code reuse and improve composition. I'm Tyler. I teach at tylermcginnis.com, and you can find me pretty much anywhere at Tyler McGinnis. Thanks, everyone.